Welcome back to We Be Kids. Throughout all of our lives, we're searching for contentment and happiness. But what does that really look like? Some people think that happiness is found in buying and collecting things. But in this rhyming story, we learn from the rich fool how the opposite of that might be true. I heard this story many years ago under a starry sky in New Hampshire, and I'm excited to share it here with you. This story is called The Rich Fool. We live in a world of materiality, where it's salaries and possessions that often determine if we live successfully. We encourage self-indulgence. We encourage wealth and greed, whilst elsewhere there are millions and millions of hungry people still to feed. So I ask, is this truly the way we should live? Would we not be much more if we were instead encouraged to give? So I'm going to tell you a story. It's actually quite old. It's a story that a famous man once told. A long time ago in a land far, far away, there lived a rich man who did nothing all day but to sit and to wonder, to hope and to plan new ways of becoming a much richer man. And each day, from his house to his fields he would walk. He'd examine his grain, every leaf and every stalk, and then he'd climb to the top of his big storage bins, where he kept all his grain, and he'd sit there and grin. He'd watch as his slaves laboured hard in the sun, bringing grain to his bins, loading ton after ton after ton. And as he carefully counted the loads as they came, he dreamt of his riches, his wealth, and his fame. Then one day, a few hungry birds in the sky overhead, they saw the big bins of grain, and so downward they sped. Oh, how happy they were, for at last they could eat. So they landed and started to dine on the wheat. But when the rich man saw them eating his grain, he shouted and he screamed and he waved his big cane. "Get away from my grain, get away from my bins, or I'll hit you so hard that your heads will all spin." And he swung with such force that he fell from his ladder right into his big bins of grain, and then this made him madder. And with all of his wriggling and his squirming around, some of his grain fell out of the bin and onto the ground. "Oh, my grain," he shouted and muttered. "It can't be wasted, it can't," he muttered. Now a poor man had started to pick up the wheat. For his wife and 6 children, they had nothing to eat. "Stop it, you thief!" cried the rich man, alarmed. And the poor man went running for fear he'd be harmed. And then when the rich man saw how much of his grain had been spilt, he cried out, "New bins for my grain'll just have to be built. I'll tear down the old bins," he said gleefully, "and I'll build bigger bins. Oh, how grand they will be." So his slaves worked hard, and his slaves worked long to build the new bins so big and so strong. And when the work was finally done, comed the night, gone was the sun, he looked up at his bins, all full of pride, as full of the bins with the grain inside. Then he walked back to his house, and he looked in the mirror, and he spoke to himself, and he saw a good hearer, and he said, "I am a remarkable guy. My riches will last till the day that I die. I'll wear nice clothes that are made of gold thread. I'll wear gems on me belt, on me hands and on me head. I'll eat and I'll drink and I'll dance and I'll play and I'll build bigger things for the rest of my day. And with one last look at his glorious bins, he jumped into bed and he tucked himself in. One day, he said, I'll start anew. I'll live as others would want me to. But first things first, myself, I'll please. And I'll live this life in wealth and in ease. And he snuggled on down into his big, cosy bed. I'll think of my future tomorrow, he said. But then that very night, he died in his sleep. And there was no one to mourn him. And there was no one to weep. You see, this man had been greedy with all of his wheat. He'd offered no food for the hungry to eat. And because he was selfish and greedy and cruel, he's not called the rich man. He's called the rich fool. So what is the moral of the story, you say? Well, dedication to possessions just isn't the way. You see, your new car, your big house, your TV, they don't give you thanks. Your new watch, your new ring, your jewellery, they don't love you back. So if you can take some advice from this story about how we should live, it's to forget about getting and instead learn to give. Thanks for stopping by for this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Please share it with your friends and we'll see you again at We Be Kids. Bye.